speaking. And without further ado, I think we'll move on into that. And if I can get things cranked around here to do the share screen and get that part of it done. All right, I'm hoping that everyone can hear me as I'm speaking. As the older I get, the less volume I seem to have in my voice. This is Barb Chuko's contribution, and I didn't see Barb on the list of people that are with us today, but we'll go ahead and comment on hers. My comments about this are that this painting is one with a story. It's as though it's a travelogue commentary that needs to be accompanying the painting. And we're drawn in to the frame. We want to know more about what's actually happening. The artist's choice of palette gives me the sensation of a dry climate. And the inclusion of a portrait of a person in it, it's as though the primary actor in the scene has something to tell us, something to say about their daily life. And the composition and the positioning of his part lead us further into that story. And I think she's done an excellent job of composing this thing. So your eye travels around the frame, looking at the different parts of the frame. And then you move always back to the actual person there. And this is almost a painting that occasionally you see one where they have text that's attached to the painting to add to the story. I think this one might well have that. Okay, we'll move on to our next, if I do it right. And Rod?
Sure. Let's see here. Dave has painted a dramatic time of day that's always full of boldness and subtlety and nuance. And I see that here. There's some nice subtlety in the washes, particularly in the warm band that is most of the sky as it transitions away from the sun, and the oranges towards the soft violets off to the left. Nicely done. And even up high, that's a really nice sensitive transition to a cold color of the blue. Sometimes with different mediums, it's easy to get a little muddy in the transition. It seems to make a nice break there into the blue that's almost imperceptible. So well done there. Also some really nice textures in the silhouettes. We get a sense of a place, not exactly entirely, especially on the left with the palm trees and the foliage going off the upper right margin. And another thing that's really well done here is the structure itself, especially the supporting structure, how it's carefully given a soft touch and value, and not even connecting all of it. It's just kind of hinted at in some places, which is all you really need, I think, for our eye to complete the structure. And the end result is that part of the structure is not a distraction to the eye. I might have suggest that some of that same philosophy be applied to some of the darker areas of the structure as well, to soften some of the edges. And you would still have the structure, especially the upper part of structure, serving its purpose as the focal area of interest in this piece. It wouldn't diminish that power at all. Probably another area that I would consider a little more emphasis on is the foreground. It is not where you want to stay in the painting. You want to get beyond it, and you certainly do. But on the other hand, it's, at least in this photo, so devoid of detail that I feel like it's a wasted area, the painting, as far as eye interest goes. You could certainly slide in another value, not quite as dark as the rest of the value in general there, and get some sense of what's going on in the foreground. Maybe there's a faint trace of a path or something, or some variation in foliage. It's just kind of lost there as a black hole. So I think that area could be capitalized on and make an even stronger piece.
Okay. This is Vivian Ripley's contribution to our critique today. And Vivian has depicted a really well executed path to lead us into the center of interest, which is the barn. It's where she wants our eyes to go. We travel past a shaded area of really well done trees and foliage. They're dark, which allows us to move past them and on to the actual subject that she wants us to really go to. And some added points of interest that she put into the painting that wouldn't necessarily have added or have been put into the painting, but she did include them. I imagine they were there. There's the ladder and the open area on the right side of the barn. That really held my interest, and the fact that the barn contrasts with the green, so the red jumps out. And then I notice in the far distance that they've got to be trees, and they indicate themselves as trees back there with the bright sunshine on them. But she didn't spend a lot of effort delineating those, which would have detracted from her main center of interest. And coming back to the choice of greens, if you look through the painting, there's probably every kind of green you can think of. There's really, really deep greens, which are almost blacks of the trees and some of the foliage. And then the barnyard with the sun hitting it with the same intensity that it's hitting those distant trees gives you a spotlight there. Your eye kind of travels in a circle within the very center of the frame. And I remember where she was. She was sitting on the back of her car, and we were out at that farm with all the animals and things, and she was like up on a hill. And I think this is actually a stable, because they have a riding stable there. But so this was in acrylic. I remember watching her apply the acrylics. Well done, Vivian. Rod?
Okay, is Diana with us? I don't see her name there.
Diana Anderson, you don't see it?
She's no, I have the image. Diana is not with us today. I'll speak briefly on this piece.
Yeah, I think she would appreciate if we go ahead and critique it.
Sure. She might watch the recording.
Yeah, she has to work.
Right. It looks like a watercolor or a watered down acrylics as a medium here of choice. Nice vertical in the composition with the tree off to the left. And there's some nice area of interest with the building and the striped awnings in the middle ground beyond the trees, starting to get some sunlight, and some nice warmth coming from the stones of the building and the column out in front, counterposed against the greens. Got the red and green playing against each other from the awnings and the umbrella. I think if you wanted to make this a stronger piece, I'd start with a couple of things. And one is, it's great that the trees in the upper half of the painting have a different temperature. That adds a nice variety. I'm having a little trouble reading the cooler green tree that's towards the right as opposed to the higher left one. The green tree versus the warmer green, taller tree. It looks like it's maybe coming out in front of the tall tree, which obviously it isn't based on where its trunk is. So there's a remedy for that, and it's darkening slightly some of the bottom edge of that upper warmer green tree. Easier to describe it with my finger if I could, but I think if that tree wasn't so light, almost the same value as the emerald green tree below it, then you would read that upper tree as hanging out above and in front of that tree, and I wouldn't have this weird sensation at the top of the smaller, rounder emerald tree is starting to come in front of that big tree. And I think a little more play on the temperature of the stone would help too, particularly on the column out front. It's really in, looks like it's probably in shadow, and yet it's as warm as any of the lighter areas of stone on the building over by the awning. So if the temperature of that could have been shifted to a cooler stone color, much like the tall trunk of that tree has been shifted a little bit with some purple on it, that would probably help read the temperature of the scene a little better. There's a few irregularities on the drawing of the windows, which I assume were actually same size across there. So that's a little distracting too, especially that left one looks like it's a little underdrawn in size compared to the other ones. But it's a nice piece and a nice design, and great to have a vertical in there that really makes a piece much more interesting. And there's a nice variation in the greens too as well. Thanks for sharing that, Diana.
This is by Don Reither, and I'm not sure if Don was going to be able to be with us this morning. He was questioning he had something else that was going to occupy his time as well, but
I made it.
And comment. So, well, he's with us. Okay. This is a painting in my mind that could only be done by an outdoor enthusiast and an animal lover, and that would be required to be able to paint it this well. The perspective and the composition are particularly well done. And we know we're in a densely wooded area with well done trees and foliage framing either side of the painting. And the subjects that the artist has depicted are the deer, doe and her fawn. And for those of you who know a little bit about deer and so forth, the fawn is a little older and traveling with mom, because you can tell that by the size, but also by the fact that it doesn't have the spots that a newborn has. And so there's a lot into the story that we feel like we're drawn into it. And anatomically, the animals are well depicted. Sometimes we see paintings of animals and you don't know exactly what it is that's wrong, but something just doesn't look right. The head's too big, it's at an angle that's not natural, the legs don't look right, but I think Don's done a really, really good job of putting this all together. Actually, Don sent two paintings. One was a watercolor that he had worked on to get ready to do this painting in oil. And it's just got a wonderful feel to it. You'll be able to sell that for sure. Okay.
Okay, yes. Christine's painting, I believe it's a watercolor, since that's what it looks like and she typically uses. Mm-hmm. And she has injected a lot of interesting textures in this painting, not only in the trees in the background with varying techniques of dry brush, wet, maybe dabbing. There's a lot of interesting detail or textures. I wouldn't necessarily call it detail, but be that as it may, and as it should, it's reflected in the water to some degree too in places, but with some restraint, because if you had all that animation of texture going on in the background and also in the water, it might become a little overwhelming for the eye. So I like that she has put some of that in the water, which would be true to life, but not gotten too carried away with recreating all of that animation in the water. Helps the eye rest a little bit. It looks like the boat is, I don't know if it's moored to a bush on the edge of the shore or not. I'm not sure about that. And I'm not sure that that even bothers me at all, really. I'll point out that the reflections, she's following a good strategy on reflections, and you can see that in the boat. The white, lightest part of the boat is darker, slightly darker in the reflection. And sometimes the darker parts of objects, when they're reflected in the water, can be a little lighter too. Things tend to go to less contrast when they are reflected in the water in general. It's not a hard and fast rule though, but I can see that she's giving thought to that, where she's taken some of the shoreline off to the right in the background where it's light at the base and it's a little darker or considerably darker in the water. So she's thinking about how the water changes how something looks value-wise. And there can be some temperature shifts too, but that gets a little more complicated and tricky to talk about in this piece. But she's thinking about the value shift in the water, and it's mostly working for her, I think. I'm looking here, and I believe that in the lower right, this is a shoreline area, not positive, but I say that because some of the rocks there have sharper shadows, which would be indicative more that the rocks are out of the water, because again, just like shadows, or excuse me, reflections on water, things underneath the water, when you can see them through the water, tend to start to get a narrower contrast range too. So if those rocks are underwater, I'd say that the contrast between light and dark is a little, probably too heavy-handed, but if they're out of the water, then it's probably about right and nice. And if you look just beyond those rocks in the water, it looks like some shapes outlined, which would be indicating rocks continuing in the water, which is one method to try to show the difference between rocks out of the water or rocks in the water. So
Okay.
probably a little busy here in the lower left and the reflections. As reflections get further away from the object that's being reflected, you start to lose a lot of detail, and you can get into simplification, which can give the eye a nice opportunity to rest as well. So it's probably a little overworked here in the lower left as far as different value streaks running around there. That would be my only other comment of constructive criticism. But thanks, Christine, for sharing this nice piece with us.
Okay. This is Linda Coe's watercolor. And Linda has done a really highly detailed painting of a close-up. She takes us right into the grape arbor and up close to them. It's almost like a macro picture of the painting of the grapes. Great perspective and composition. And she shows us the primary subject I think she wants us to rest on, at least where my eyes went immediately to the grapes, which are both ripe and green. And that's usually what happens in a grape arbor, is you've got some clusters of grapes where some of them are green and some of them are ripe. And I think the fact that she included the dark green, bluish green leaf below the grapes there holds your interest from traveling away from where she wants you to rest your eyes. And I noticed particularly that throughout the painting there are some yellow greens, some deep greens, some blue greens, and that variety adds a lot of interest to the paintings. And the fact that you can have sky holes where you're looking out and seeing through the arbor, and you know that's what's going to happen. If you're down low looking up at some grapes, you're going to see through to the sky. It's a very interesting painting, very, very well done. Okay, Rod.
Okay, here's Bill. And I believe, Bill, you're using pastels here, which you do a lot of.
Yep.
And I don't do a lot of pastel in the past. I think there's an interesting technique going on in the background. It's not the first thing that I see, of course, but I see that and realize something a little different going on there. Maybe some kind of alcohol introduction or some kind of wash technique, tool technique. It's interesting. It adds a different textural feel to the whole piece in general. I'll start there. Going back to what's most important though, the composition I think is nicely sized and appropriately placed in a vertical composition. And you've got a nice, even though they're both glass, they're totally different objects because one is obviously a soda and a dark color, and it's got this dynamic red cap on it that's pretty dazzling. I might tone that down a bit, but I hate to say that because I'm really enjoying looking at it, but the placement of it is a little further outside the bounds of where you might have a normal focal area, but rules are made to be broken, as they say too, so I don't think I have a hard problem with that at all. And if you look at the base or the bottom of that bottle of soda, Bill's done a really nice job of incorporating some colors into it from the shadow, and the shadow seems to reflect some of the brownish of the soda bottle as well. So there's a nice trade-off between the bottom of the bottle and the shadow. They're both talking, sharing their different languages together, if you will, browns and deep, soft, muted gray purples. It's really nicely done. And you see some of that happening in the glass, which looks like it's empty as well. There's a little bit of play in the shadow there between the glass and it, but since it doesn't have a fluid in it, it's going to have less and less influence on the shadow around it. It has a little bit of influence. Nice warm foreground and nice treatment of the transition between the foreground and the shrubbery in the back. It's a nice area of interest without being distracting. You transition so smoothly with that soft touch of the transitions that it serves as a good backdrop without being even hardly sensed. It serves its purpose really well. I really like the edge of the glass at the top too. Sometimes glass where it's thicker can really capture an extra intensity of saturated color, and that's what it kind of looks like it's doing there too. And that's an interesting thing to observe when you're looking at still lifes and capitalizing on those little gems of opportunities like that. Thanks, Bill.
You bet. This is Deb Howlers, and Deb has given us an overall painting here with a glow of a magenta color. At least that's what I'm perceiving is magenta. And she had careful placement of the glassware. It tells me that she spent some time setting up her composition for this still life rather than just kind of like haphazardly placing things. You move things around until you think, that's what I really want to paint. And being able to see the edges of the glassware and then to see through in some places, and then the spectral highlights bouncing back at you to give depth to the painting. And the large vessel to the left is the only one that's got something in it. It's got a fluid in it, and that gives volume to the painting and some weight to that side. And even though that's the large part of the painting, the largest subject, I think it's well balanced overall. And the spectral highlights that flash off of glass when we're painting glass is something that's really interesting to depict. So it's not monochromatic. She's got values and changes in chroma there that make the overall painting very interesting.
Okay, here is Rich Clems. I'm not sure, let's see, is Rich, yes, he's with us. Hopefully you can hear us today, Rich. This is a lovely piece. And obviously the bridge is the focal area and the area around it. He's got a few edges there. Highlights on the shrubbery at the foot of both ends of the bridges stand out as being fairly different from everything else in terms of color, temperature, and in contrast as well. So it works really well in cementing the footing of that bridge that's sitting on the ground and contributing to your eye going over there. And of course, that flash of white underneath the bridge that would be beyond the bridge seals the deal, so to speak, for making that a really strong, if not powerful, focal area. Looking at the road that goes across the bridge, I like the placement of it. It's above the halfway mark. It's a prominent horizontal band, and it hasn't been placed in a disadvantageous position. It's a little more than halfway up. And if you look at the composition in general, there's a nice variety of overall shapes. If you simplified this down, you'd have a shape of land in the foreground on the right. There's no other shape like that in the painting. There's the shape of the water. There's no other shape in the painting like that. The land beyond the bridge before the background trees, there's no other shape in the painting like that. And in particular, when I say that, if you look at that shape in the background beyond the bridge before the trees, and then compare it to the thickness that's been dedicated to the sky, they're quite different, which is a really nice thing to remember. If he'd put the horizon with the trees halfway between the bridge path and the top of the thing, it would have been a little less energetic of a composition. And he was careful to move the horizon down a little bit off that halfway point between the top of the painting and the pathway. Rich is obviously very experienced, and he's always thinking about things like that. Don't repeat things. Shapes, the big shapes, and some of the smaller things. For instance, the trees in the background, even though they're of similar shape, their scale is quite different, and their treatment's a little bit different, and there's some variation in color, temperature in them that helps out. And I think the piece just works really well. You might say to yourself, wow, how does Rich get away with such powerful colors in certain places? For example, that blue in the foreground water is really